Want a pen and paper?
Okay, everyone. Well, good evening. I'd like to welcome you all to the third and final event in the Spring 2024 virtual series of the City Talks on the theme of Museums in the City, Rethinking Colonial Urban Pasts. My name is Ruben Rose Redwood, and I'm a professor of geography and associate dean academic in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada, as well as chair of the UVic Committee for Urban Studies, which organizes the City Talks lecture series. I'd like to begin with a territory acknowledgement that we acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, and Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Victoria for sponsoring the City Talk series. And I'm joined tonight by my co-organizer, Denise Unsel, who is an assistant professor of communications and culture at Royal Roads University. And Denise is a cultural anthropologist and museum and heritage studies scholar. And she will be discussing the theme of the Spring 2024 series a bit further and then introduce tonight's speakers. So on behalf of the UVic Committee for Urban Studies, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I'll now pass things over to Denise.
Thank you, Ruben. Good evening, everyone. Hello from the ancestral lands of the Lekwungen-speaking people. When we started with planning of these series in the spring, our aim was to focus on the relation between cities and museums, from especially city museums in colonial cities. So we learn a lot from city museums about the history of the place, changing nature and scope of social relations, urbanization, urban development, colonization, migration, globalization, all these big words. And city museums in colonial cities can often serve as spaces of collective self-reflection, and they offer opportunities to engage in difficult but required conversations. They play a role in placemaking as well. So in this series, our first guest in January was Dr. Cole Thrush, professor in history from UBC, University of British Columbia. And he focused on 19th and early 20th century urban development and colonialism on the Salish Sea, specifically in Seattle, Victoria, and Vancouver. And his talk was not specifically about museums, but as a historian, he reflected a lot on narratives on indigenous peoples and how they related to the urban life, and especially with the development and colonialism. So he left us with insights on the narration of indigenous experiences in urban colonial pasts in museums. But our second speaker was from a city museum, from Museum of Vancouver, Director of Collections and Exhibitions, Viviane Gosselin. And she illustrated the decolonial practices that have been developed and employed in the Museum of Vancouver, from community building to exhibition making to collections. And her presentation was not only about how to narrate history, but how to rethink the museum work holistically, the whole practice of museology. So this approach and practice in museology is informed by the ongoing discussions and work in this field, on ethics, community engagement, diversity, reconciliation, inclusion. And today's speakers will offer another example to these practices, this time from the East Coast. Jennifer Carter and Catherine Charlebois will engage in a conversation about recent visioning work undertaken at the newly inaugurated MEM, Centre des mémoires montréalais. And the work its professionals have engaged with regards to citizen museology. So that's an interesting topic to explore. And a few words about our guests today. So Jennifer Carter is an associate professor in the Department of Art History and director of the Interfaculty Graduate Museology programs at the Université du Québec à Montréal. A core area of her research investigates the global phenomena of human rights museums and considers how historical and social justice are negotiated curatorially and pedagogically in cultural institutions dedicated to human rights in different geocultural and political contexts around the world. And Catherine Charlebois is the section chief at the MEM. She has been the curator of exhibitions and collections from 2009 to 2019. She's recognized as a leader in the museum sector in the field of oral history and has led many museum projects which honor and defend the importance of living memory. And as a specialist in the display of oral histories, she's coordinated many award-winning exhibitions. And Catherine worked at the McCourt Museum of Canadian History as an educational coordinator and at the Museum Village as a curator. Jennifer and Catherine, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this lovely introduction, Denise. It's really a pleasure to be with you all this evening. And thank you also for the invitation to share some of our own local experiences and perspectives on this very timely subject, museums and the colonial urban past from our home in Quebec. We're speaking to you from Tiohtià:ke to the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, Munyang to the Anishinaabeg peoples, Montreal, both home to and the unceded and unsurrendered territory of Indigenous peoples. And the members of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation are the traditional guardians and caretakers of these lands and waters. And today, Tiohtià:ke is home to a diverse population of First Peoples and settler communities, as well as culturally diverse peoples from around the globe. And we acknowledge the devastating legacies and violences that settler colonialism caused and that continue to impact upon First Peoples and their communities owing to intergenerational trauma, as well as ongoing structural inequities and inequalities in everyday life. And universities and museums are, of course, not exempt from these conditions. In many ways, they can perpetuate them. We therefore also acknowledge the continuing work that must occur within these sectors. And because we're talking about museums, museums in particular this evening, the latter as institutions born of imperial and colonizing conquests and extractivist practices in the 18th century. Within these institutions, we as non-Indigenous peoples can and must do better as allies in support of structural change and in support of Indigenous peoples' self-determination over their lands and their culture. As Denise mentioned, tonight's presentation is in fact a discussion with my colleague, Catherine Charlebois. I think you introduced her, Denise, as section chief, or perhaps we'll say chief curator of the newly inaugurated, since September 2023, MEM, or Centre des mémoires montréalaises. But first, I'd like to provide a little historical context. Catherine, long before becoming chief curator of MEM in a new location at the iconic intersection of Sainte-Catherine and Saint-Urbain streets, in the heart of what is known today as the Quartier de Spectacle, or Montreal's Festival District, you were a museologist at the MEM's precursor, the Centre d'Histoire de Montréal, or project manager, I should say, formerly installed in a repurposed fire hall in Old Montreal. And this unique city museum was founded in the 1980s, in 1983 to be exact, following the model we see in provincial and federal parks. And it's worth underscoring, in fact, the important role that Parks Canada and its traditions have had as an extremely influential force within museological practice in Quebec. And so the connection here is that the Centre d'Histoire de Montréal was in fact developed in the 80s as an interpretation center, like you would find in national or provincial parks. It sought to tell the story of the city's history, of Montreal's history, but without a mission to collect objects to do so. So its playground was the city and its built heritage, and thus its collection was in fact all that surrounded it. And this approach, which was fundamental to the Centre d'Histoire de Montréal, was also germane to another logic, because the neighborhood in which the Centre was originally located, Old Montreal, is veritably a museum mecca in Montreal, many of which are history museums. We can name Pointe-à-Calière, which is the city's archaeological and history museum, Chateau Ramsey, the Site historique Marguerite Bourgeois, to name but these, but also museums of other typologies, such as the Centre des Sciences de Montréal, the Centre Phi, and the Darling Foundry, to name both science and art museums. So how history was being addressed in other museums, both in Old Montreal and even more largely speaking, for example, at the McCord Museum, where you started your career, which is now the museum, the McCord and Stewart Museum of Canadian Social History, is interesting to reflect on, because the Centre d'Histoire de Montréal worked for many years to evolve its own particular identity, to evolve as something different. It started out differently, to be sure, and even preceded some of the later history museums that would open, for example, Pointe-à-Calière, which opened on the occasion of Montreal's 350th birthday celebration in 1992. So the Centre d'Histoire de Montréal, in which you worked, had evolved over its history with a small but extremely dedicated team, many members of which are now at MEM, developing exhibitions, cultural and educational programming, publications, and eventually digital tools and content with the arrival of the internet era. And through these means, you sought to introduce Montrealers and tourists alike to the richness and diversity of the city, but really on a modest scale. You asked, what is daily life like in Montreal? What are the flavors of its different neighborhoods? What is the identity, or the identities in the plural, of this unique North American city? And you did this by going to the heart of Montreal's different communities, both known and a little later less known, through temporary exhibitions, but also influenced, and I think this is very interesting, by your programming, notably for immigrants, recent immigrants to Quebec who were learning French. And all of this to ultimately celebrate the plural identities and histories that make up the fabric of Montreal. So I wonder if you can comment, first of all, on these early and formative years leading up to the MEM, where you are now. But give us a little idea about what distinguished, we were talking about this before the beginning of this evening's talk. It's really quite a remarkable story. So what distinguished the Centre d'Histoire de Montréal and your work within it?
Well, you underlined a lot of the things that were really interesting for us and made our signature in the early days, since we were not a collection-based museum, but formerly more like I would say an interpretation center. You have to think that in the 1980s, there's absolutely no museum in Montreal that talks about the city of Montreal. There's none. So we are the first, actually, in 1983. And the idea is really to offer some sort of a portal to the city, like you go in the old Montreal, which is a more touristy part of the city, and you will have some sort of a larger sense of what the city is. So that was the main objective of the Centre d'Histoire at first. And we were also in the new, it was also kind of at the time, it was a museum of new museology. I mean, meaning that we were quite different than other museums in the city, what they were offering. Since the beginning, we were always like stamped as being different or doing things differently. So it's part of our like very early,
your DNA.
Yeah, it's really part of the DNA. We were always quite different from the crowd, the larger crowds of museums in Montreal. So what happened is that, but over the year, being just an interpretation center, I believe began not to be enough. And then we started to do school programs, and we started to have, like, we had a permanent exhibit, but at one point we had temporary exhibit, and then we started to collect, but because we were doing exhibit, and we were like,
It was
kind
never a
of-
primary activity.
no,
Yeah.
but I mean, it kind of, I don't know, we added, and actually that's the beginning of our collection.
Hmm.
But it was not really planned.
Hmm.
You know, it was like more opportunity, and it's the actually seizing or opportunities is also part of our very early DNA, and it's still to this day, being different, trying things, experimenting, and being opportunist is part of who we are.
One of the things you mentioned, and I think it's worth dwelling on a little bit because people from outside of Quebec may not know some of these models, but we speak about the Musée de Société or society museums. So the idea that, I mean, it's quite widespread now, the idea that museums will address social issues, not just ideas, but social issues. But the idea of the Musée de Société as a type, which is also now further connected with eco-museums, both of which emerged here in Quebec in the 1980s.
Yeah.
Eco-museums have a little bit earlier history in France, but some of the earliest applications, well, the earliest applications in North America were in Quebec. So museums that are grounded in their environments, grounded in their communities, and dedicated to addressing social issues. And you said that those currents and the theory behind those emerging types of museums in the 80s also influenced the way the Centre d'Histoire de Montréal thought about itself and developed too, right?
Yeah. There's this aspect of being very anchored in the community, was really important for us. So it's really, I think it's an influence from the eco musée trend. And also I think there's with the Musée de Société is to a tendency to not focus on your collections or presenting collections. Since we were not collections based, we were kind of free to actually decided to do an exhibit on a very general subject or less general, but it didn't have to be directly linked to things that we were collecting. It could be like on the back alleys of Montreal, it could be on the park of Montreal, it could be on, we have one on the importance of tea in Montreal, but it's not because we have like a collections of teacups
dictated.
and teapots, because it's just because it had an impact on the Montreal society. It was important for society, or it was a signature element of the city. We could talk about it and decide to talk about it without, having objects, which actually is really important to underline, because when you do not have objects, it really changes your way to do interpretations, or the way that you're going to talk to people, or the medium that you're going to use. It's gonna, you're going to be a little bit more creative usually. So I think it helped us to do museum exhibitions and museum things without being kind of, I would say, like in the more traditional, like
Earlier, I said to you, I thought that sounded liberating, but you said actually it could be, I don't think you used the word challenge, but that nevertheless it requires a
because
different way of thinking about museology.
Yes, and when you have this label of centre d'interprétation, are you really a museum or not a museum? You don't have a collection, or you're so it was always kind of an identity crisis of not being a museum but doing things like a museum. So
acting like a museum.
Yes,
okay.
But not having the title museum. And that was not really helpful, because it sometimes was kind of difficult to market ourselves to the public. So what are you really? And centre is like center is like just could be like center for anything. So
okay, but
anyway,
slowly an identity does begin to concretize, because around 2000 an important new influence emerges. I think it's interesting to think about. Some of you may know the Musée da Pessoa, or Museum of the Person, which is a virtual museum of life stories that was created in Sao Paulo in Brazil in 1991. And that is built on values of cultural diversity, the idea that life stories can be used to achieve social transformation. This museum had a very particular unique working methodology to pursue these values. And it also sought to work collaboratively and with a high degree of public participation. And connecting with colleagues at the Museum of the Person in Brazil was an important and rewarding initiative by the longtime director of the Centre d'Histoire de Montréal, Jean-François Leclerc. And this, I think, had quite an impact on how you would develop the center. So how is this influential to the center's own deliberate turn to oral histories? I'm just giving away the punch, which ironically now constitute one of the three major collecting axes of the MEM, which comes from a center that didn't collect, that now is working on a collections policy. But let's talk about oral histories and this turn and how that affected your work.
That was actually, it wasn't seen as major at the time, but it had a major influence overall in the history of the institution. At first it was a need, we in the 1990s we were doing a lot of educational program for French learners, as you were saying earlier, and we kind of noticed that there was like giant gaps in the more traditional narratives of the city, so there was a lot of things that were said about the history of the city, but there was a lot of things that were not said, especially on specific groups and immigrants group, and I would say later one immigrants group, that the more recent immigrant groups. So there was none about that in history books, in museum, in the narrative of the city. And doing those educational program kind of focused the lights on all those stories not being told. So and there was talk with that Museo de Pessoa, there was link there. I think with the director at the time was really interested with this, like the diversity of different stories of Montreal, and also with the fact that at the same time, Mecour Museum, the Pointe-à-Calière, which was like two largest history museum in the city, we're having exhibit about the city of Montreal, which was kind of a new thing in the 1990s. Before that, we were the only one talking about the city of Montreal.
More competition.
Yeah, and so I think at the same time, it's like it was a keen interest in having like multiple voices, but I think it was also a way to do another layer of who we were and our own DNA and identity, actually being a place where other stories would be told, but not by us, with those people,
right,
with the oral history. And that was a big challenge, because in the history of oral histories in the around the 2000 era, there's the revival was starting, because actually doing recording is starting to get much more easier and less cheaper. So less expensive. So yeah.
Do you want to talk about how you proceeded to collect oral histories? It's quite a neat method. The clinics.
Oh, the clinics, yes. Actually that was an invention of the Centre d'Histoire, the clinic, the memory clinic. With the Museo de Pessoa was actually the dream at the time. It was to actually have this giant international network of Museum of the Person all over the world. So the Centre d'Histoire decided to have its own antenna, and it became Musée de la Personne. And one of the first projects that we did in 2003 was a memory clinic. And it was actually inspired by a blood clinic. And instead of giving blood, you were giving like a sample of memory. It was also having an aspect of intergenerational. We did it with the Portuguese community, which was at the time celebrating their 50th anniversary in Montreal. And it was a way to collect stories that just did exist, but did not exist in the public arena. It was just like in the community.
And it was also outsourcing, right? I mean, you went
Yes.
and met
different
community members.
Yes, and we actually
in
did
their
it
neighborhoods.
with the community because we had young, like young people from the Portuguese community that were interviewing older member of the Portuguese
That's how you
community.
did it. Okay.
Yes, that's how
Lovely.
we did
Yeah.
it. So we did it with them.
Intergenerational.
So there was like all kinds of trial experiment things that were going on. It's just, and this project led to other projects. I think in the end, and from 2003 to 2008, we had done about 8, I think, clinic projects.
All in different neighborhoods around the city.
Yes, in different groups.
And notably whose histories were not represented in mainstream historical discourses.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
So fast forward, and the Centre d'Histoire de Montréal begins to imagine a metamorphosis. This was in what year?
Oh my God. I mean,
towards the MEM, because it was nevertheless a long gestation period, but
I would
major metamorphosis, both spatial and
I
institutional.
would say the seeds of that started like really in 2009, 10.
Okay,
actually.
so say 2009, 10, and the MEM opened in the fall of 2023. So a very long gestation period.
Yes.
You'd continue to pursue longtime values of what we would call citizen museology. You refer to the mission citoyenne, or the citizen mission of the museum, to the diversity of heritage in Montreal, and how the history of Montreal's residents has both fashioned the urban environment and the city's identity. But you also eventually begin to design a space that is 3 times the size of the former fire hall. So 3,200 square meter space. Your team, many of whom the members have come with you from the Centre d'Histoire de Montréal to eventually the MEM, but it's also expanded significantly in size. You now find yourselves developing a collections policy.
Well, we have to actually did the
Oh, you've done it? Okay.
Yes. But we're gonna have to redo it.
Okay.
now.
And at the heart of this is a kind of purpose-driven question and mission to highlight and celebrate Montrealers, right? Who are Montrealers? A question which various exhibitions, but also community organized, various exhibitions that are both community organized and in-house organized, endeavor to explain. But I think other things have changed in this metamorphosis. So you've described the MEM as a laboratory, as a space of experience, as a space of learning and discovery. Can you tell us a little bit more about the initial ideas about the MEM? And I'm going to open up a PowerPoint because we have a couple of slides that we'd like to share as well that help illustrate this.
Yeah, one of the major aspect that we really didn't talk that much, but was also a signature for the Centre d'Histoire and now the MEM, is people history. So it's this focus on the human person, the citizen. And this shift actually occurred with this oral history coming in. So slowly but surely, as we did projects with oral histories, as we had exhibition projects based on oral history, the human side of history and the human side of the history of the city of Montreal began to take more and more spaces. And with the oral history coming in, also came in with the methodology of oral
collecting
history.
oral histories. Yeah.
Yes, but also the way of collecting history. And so the importance, for example, of sharing authority.
Yes.
Like important concept like this.
Right.
Actually had a major influence, not only on collecting and having those stories, but sharing authority in an exhibition. How do you do that? So we had to have major, like changing all our way of thinking
and doing
and doing things
right.
about collecting, about doing exhibits, about doing eventually educational program, cultural programming. So, like slowly but surely, this oral history thing actually kind of infused everything, changed everything, and it actually gave birth to the MEM. Because the shift of doing a more traditional type of museum, which was the model for us in a way, we started to shift toward a more oral history based museum, citizen based, and this importance of being like a place where we would actually share or open our arms to other narratives, but making sure that what we have to say is not as much important than what the people, the citizen wants to say. Like that's the sharing of authority.
Did you eventually have community members coming to you and saying, we'd like to share oral histories?
Yeah.
We'd like to use this methodology?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Because what happened between 2010 and 2017, 3 major exhibits were presented at Centre d'Histoire de Montréal, which were oral history based.
Okay, tell us.
And when we start, the first one was Lost Neighborhoods. So it was the story of, it was actually a based photograph on archival material that were found in the Archive of Montreal about 3 neighborhoods that were demolished by the city of Montreal. We are a city museum of the city of Montreal. We're talking about what this, like the city that we
politically
represent, politically actually
sensitive.
Demolished neighborhood. And we actually went back to people that live in those neighborhoods in the days to talk about the life in their neighborhood, but also the demolition of their own neighborhoods. And so that's one of example. And then we did one on scandal, vice crime and morality in Montreal. But we were linking with the politics at the time in Montreal, with the scandal of embezzlement and money and what, and then we did one on Expo 67 and for the celebration of the 50th anniversary, but always with oral history based, because it was always the people history, what they had to say about the history of Montreal, that was the main focus. But with those projects, we actually were saying to the museum community, we're serious about that. We're serious about, sharing the narrative with the people, with the Montrealers. And we're so serious about that, that's going to become the focus. All those 3 different exhibits, one after the other, also help us understand what to do with the oral history within
the possibilities and the limits.
Yes, and within a museum,
framework.
Yes.
So that said, let me see.
There's so much.
Affichage, diaporama. Is this? Can everybody see the screen? It's in.
That works great. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, so we've just put up the mission and vision statement of the new MEM. Maybe you want to read it?
Well, it looks so easy now, but it took 2 years to write that thing. But the process, I think, is even more interesting than what is written. But actually, it was actually done over 2 years with all the member of staff.
Okay.
And we wrote it together. And I just highlighted, I made it bold, like the diversity, the importance of diversity, to be authentic, the aspect of inclusive human experiences, the citizens, and tell their own stories. So for the mission is really key there. But what is it also interesting is we had a time, and we took the time to think of a vision. I think that's the first time that
you had one,
that we had one. We had missions before, so we kind of changed it. But having a vision, so this is actually this dream of what we were tending to probably in the 10 years or so. So the MEM will be a stimulating essential actor in Montreal cultural ecosystem, capable of bringing citizens together, contributing to their awareness of diverse realities of the city, the past and present aspect of it is really important to us, so that we can actually build a well-informed, actively engaged community together. So projects like we're doing right now, you know, it's you know,
Yeah.
it goes into that vision.
And I think actually one of the first examples of how the MEM brought to get citizens together is in the development of consultative committees. And this is really quite an impressive aspect of the development of this project, because as I mentioned, it was many years in the making, just the initial ideas. But then once you got down to it and knew that you were going to be moving locations, expanding, working with a certain DNA, but also wanting to meet this mission statement, the idea of consultative committees became incontournable, as we'd say in French. Can you say a little bit about the work involved? I mean, we have a sense here, 10 committees, 85 people consulted from 2 to 8 times, and there's quite a range of committees too. How did this work? And how did these meetings change the way you initially were thinking about the MEM and how you operate today?
Actually, within those 3, you know, I was talking about those 3 different exhibits that we did. We also had, at the same time, we had other projects going on, but the notion of co-creating that was getting more and more talked about, influential work that were done with Nina Simon, for example.
Yes.
Were really, really big influence for us. So this idea of sharing creation of our projects, sharing the authority, as I was saying. So we came within the idea of, you know, like dreaming about that museum and wanting to build this museum. We said, you know, we cannot do it without other people, without citizens. So
significant citizen input.
Yes. So the co-creation was the inspiration to actually firsthand think about having committees to dream and think about this new museum. So actually, what you're seeing right now is the end roadmap of all those committees, but it started with actually 2 committees, which were the citizens and the advisory committee.
Okay.
So the 2 external committees for the first one. That was my first actually project that I had to do when we started to think about the museum. So I had to put together those 2 external committees. But then, you know, of course, the MEM staff committee came in. The steering committee, you know, was something that we cannot go without.
In-house committees, but what would be the distinction between your citizens and advisory committees? And how did you go about inviting people onto these committees?
The advisory, I wanted to have one that was a bit more about, I would say, academic world, but not just academic. It was a mix of people that had done a lot of work in different areas that we were looking to. It could be in museum studies, it could be in urban landscaping, it could be like in urban development, in all kinds of areas, but people that were consequential in either researching or doing things within the city of Montreal. So they had some sort of a background, but they had work with the citizens in some ways.
Okay.
The citizen committee was also a mix, a really large mix of people. We were about 12 in each committees. But we wanted to have citizens that had work, for example, in heritage of the city, history and heritage, people that had work in doing work with citizens in the tourist area, or more legal justice, you know, like you know,
social justice,
social justice,
community organizations,
community organizations, working with immigrants, you know, like all kinds of subjects that were interesting for. We also have native history, you know, like marginalized history, things like that, in those two committees.
And then you also had subcommittees that
Yeah, because
had a
when we did,
special-
when we did our
Like a-
first two meeting with the advisory and the citizens, we noticed right hand that, you know, like that was not enough. We needed to have moments that we would focus much more on the stories and the presence of First Nations within this museum, the marginalized group, and accessibility.
Right.
So the first conversations that we have with the citizens and the advisory actually gave birth to those subcommittees.
And so out of those conversations, how would you say the practices of the MEM have been shaped by these consultative discussions, and particularly from a decolonizing perspective? What new insights did you gain from those meetings and discussions?
Well, what you really have to understand is that the MEM was actually shaped by those committees, because when I say they were consulted, for example, 8 times, the citizens advisory, for example, were consulted 8 times. So at the 8 different moments that were shaping the museum, we asked them, you know, what are you thinking about what we're trying to do with this museum? So we would have meeting with them. They would give their opinions, and they had impact. You know, it was not just like informative committees that were not just about like sharing ideas and, well, by the way, if you like that idea, you know, take it, you do whatever you want.
Here's the real
It was
investment.
really investment. And we add what we really wanted to say to those committees when we started is that what you're going to say, we're really going to take it in account, and it's going to have an impact on the development of the institution. I remember, you know, some people that I approached at first, you know, they really didn't want to go into committees because they said, you know, oh, well, I've done that like too much times, and there's like big promises, and there's not,
too
you know,
little
yeah.
reflection.
So anyway, so they really had a lot of impact because, for example, we took their ideas, we gave that to the design team firsthand. They did a concept. The concept would brought them back to the committees. They could give them their opinions. The opinions were like all, we had like big, everything that was said was actually then put in a big chart. We would, like redo all the, we would take those comments, try to make sense of them, send them back to the design team. The design team would have to read, it was like
very democratic process.
Yes, but it made such a difference. Because I remember when we did the last meeting, one of the most extraordinary comments that we had said, I'm looking at the MEM and I see myself.
This is from one of the committee members.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So
a lot of the members actually said, they said, what I said at this meeting, I see it right now. I see that you listen to me, and it's right there. Because one of the big challenge that we have is that the mandate that we had was we had to make a museum about all the identities of the series. Not first, it started with what is the identity of Montreal,
and it pluralized.
And then it pluralized. What are the identities of Montreal?
Yeah.
Well, how do you do that? How do you put that in 3D?
I think it's an ongoing process for sure.
I mean, it felt like almost impossible, but they made it possible because we had a chance to talk to so many people with so many point of views, and it's not because we couldn't consult the whole population. It was not that was not possible, but I quite, now that we've gone through the process, I think we had enough point of views and different ways of seeing it and time so to process it. it shows now. It shows that we talk to a lot of
Mhm,
people
mhm.
in the end result.
But I presume that that also means you had to think about reaching out to new spaces and new communities and
Yes.
really step out of your comfort zone in your
Yes.
areas of your
Yeah.
traditional go-to places
Yeah, it was
in order to
actually,
pursue
I
this
must say,
vision of inclusion.
it was the first time that we had a communities with First Nations. It was the first time that
Since
we
1983,
actually,
so the 40-year history.
yes. Not that we didn't do anything with First Nations in the Centre d'Histoire, but it was really the first time that we could actually have a conversations with them and say, in a new museum talking about Montreal, what would you love to see about First Nations in that city
History.
museum?
Yeah.
Same thing for the marginalized group, or it was the first time that we really addressed the notion of accessibility in this museum, like accessibility in a larger sense.
So when you talk about marginalized groups, members of marginalized groups, it's
For example,
which groups in particular?
the Centre d'Histoire, one of the very important marginalized group was sex workers for us,
Okay.
because we are in the former red light of Montreal, and a lot of their stories as the city of Montreal has really tried to clean up the story out of the neighborhood where we are. I've really I would say gone out of their ways to make sure that it's not there.
A sanitized
It's
history.
sanitized.
Yeah.
And so it was fundamental for us to have them within. But it was a first to have all those people around a table talking about, like the history of sex work, the importance of First Nations, but not First Nations like in the colonized time, but right now, what are First Nations in Montreal in the modern city?
And what are the issues you want to be speaking about?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
And this brings us to another slide about the values that are infused in the work that and that guide the work that you're doing. Maybe you could say a few words about this chart.
well, the values actually were really influenced by I think, like a thinking process that we were going through working at that vision and mission. And at one point we were saying to ourselves, how can we be accessible? How can we have a conversation, an honest and authentic conversations and dialogue with citizens if we actually put ourselves as an institution? It doesn't make sense, like this big institution that in the downtown Montreal, if we think as a building, it won't work. We have to think that we are a person, that we are a living organism. So what was the inspiration for that was emotional intelligence. What is the emotional intelligence in a person?
So you really brought it down to the individual level?
Yes. So we wanted to be like a human museum, like a living thing, instead of just like being like a building. So we said to ourselves, well, we transformed it, but it became, like being human, inclusive, and current community, bold, and agents of change, which are really actually inspired by the 5 concept of what is emotional intelligence.
What about, working and co-creating exhibitions? I remember an article by Sam Alberti and Bernadette Lynch that I read many years ago, who examined in a very critical and reflexive way a project that they had done while working at the Museum of Manchester, if I remember correctly, with a community, and they reflected on the experience of this, saying, at the end of the day, we wanted to open up the house, the museum. We wanted to work in a participatory way. But at the end of the day, museums, just by virtue of being museums, control the budget, control the calendar. How have you managed to circumvent this? Because, some communities may work at a different pace, and that so how do you, this power dynamic that may still stay in place, how do you How do you work with
Well,
that?
that's an excellent question because it was part of the reflection first, and are we gonna do that? Well, there's different way of co-creating. Co-creating is not just one thing. Um, one of the way that we I think we could, as you said, circumvent this is we decided that first we would have in the museum a free access space, which are public spaces now what we call.
Okay.
When you come in at the MEM, you don't have a ticket booth that actually welcomes you.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
it's a
Which can be a
person.
barrier for
Yes.
many because of the cost of
So
entering
there's a
museums these days.
person. It's not a counter with a cash register. There's a person that
Right.
welcomes you
Okay.
and that invite you to explore. And within that public free access space, there's two exhibition spaces that are solely reserved to projects from the community.
Mhm.
We cannot, as a museum, use those spaces for projects that we would do just by ourselves.
Mhm.
So that's a limit that we put on ourselves. So we have to have citizens that work in those projects, or we have to present projects that has been done
Mhm.
by citizens, and we are just a place where they can shine again.
Mhm. I like how you
You
put
know?
that. Yeah.
So, and it works. For so far, we've been open for almost 6 months, and so far it's like amazing how it's working, because we actually, as a museum, we said to ourselves, this is reserved for that. This is the function, this is the role of those spaces, is to have community dialogue. And then what happens is that the way that we're going to do those projects are quite different than other projects, that the co-creation is not as much, is not as important, or like it's not the forefront of different projects. We do projects that are co-created, from first
start to finish.
Yes. And then we have other projects that are not built that way. And we don't work the same way.
So in these spaces, you give your expertise as exhibition makers, but the content is brought
If
by
it's
members of the community.
necessary,
Is that it?
because there's some groups that are quite
those
big.
expertise
Yes,
as well?
yes.
Yeah.
If we're gonna actually meet with the groups or the individual or the citizens, and they're gonna be the ones saying, at this step of the process, we would like to co-create with you, and at this step of the process, we don't really need, and we're gonna say, okay, fine,
Mhm.
do your thing. And
Mhm.
at this step, at this, so it's all actually the co-create. The planification of the
Mhm.
projects is
Mhm.
also co-created, and that's key.
You know what? That's, I think, a really important distinction. So you
That's
decide on the map, the
together.
calendar together, and what's
Yes.
feasible,
And what
is
can
not,
you do? What can you
modify.
bring to the table? What can I bring to the table? And it's gonna influence the project and the fringe, how it's gonna be designed,
Mhm.
because you're co-creating, so you're gonna co-create the plan.
Mhm. Do we have a few more minutes? There's one other element I'd like to touch upon. Ruben, yes?
Sure, that's fine. Yeah. Say
Well,
another,
one last.
another 5 minutes or so. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I personally, I'm a member of the Coalition of Museums for Climate Justice on the advisory council, as was Viviane Gosselin, who spoke at the last event. And I've been thinking a lot about the role of museums in helping us to think through and act upon the largest problem that humanity faces, the climate emergency. I mean, we have to put out all the stops to collectively address the health of our planet. And clearly, there's no one single solution. There must be a plurality of social practices and solutions that are put into play. But we need to act, and we need to act creatively, and we need to act now. And with that in mind, museums as repositories of cultural and natural heritage, but also as civic institutions with responsibilities, but also a considerable toolkit, as we were discussing, of transdisciplinary skills, museums are perfectly poised to enact meaningful change. Bob Janes makes this argument very powerfully and articulately. He's been making this argument for well over a decade. You may remember his book, Museums in a Troubled World, Renewal, Irrelevance, or Collapse, which was released in 2009, and which is already a very sobering call to action. And I think that city museums in particular should and can make this a priority of their work, because no question about it, we urgently need to be reimagining how we live. And by this, I don't mean simply environmental imaginings and living sustainably, although this is key, but we also need to account for social and political injustices, because as we well know, climate disasters have impacted upon worlds that have the least contributed to the state of emergency in which we find ourselves, and yet they are also the most adversely affected. So we need to learn new forms of political engagement and ecological action in the world. And this is where I think city museums come in. City museums can help nurture and develop social practices that we desperately need in contemporary society. We know that collective action in fighting the climate emergency is key, and collectives need to be mobilized and catalyzed. And as local institutions, I think city museums are really in a unique position to galvanize collective action. We also need to be experimenting with new forms of cooperation, intersectoral. And again, I'm thinking about some of the examples that we saw museums leaping into during the pandemic, which were just really wonderful examples. Food depots, providing online education when schools weren't open, providing hubs for connection, but online, albeit, or drop-off sites for computers to share with kids who didn't have computers at a time when so much of the world moved online. What are your thoughts about the potential for city museums to galvanize these kinds of collectivities, to rethink forms of political agency, to have this kind of remit because of their scale, because they are of a certain size, you are of a certain size, that I think allows you to be more nimble than, say, a national museum?
Well, I think an institution, for example, like us, we have a facility to reach a lot of different individual, a lot of different groups. The fact, for example, the fact that we consult so many people, they feel that we're gonna listen to them, that we're gonna listen to their preoccupation. I remember within all the conversation that we had with the committees, something that was really, really important is not just to talk about the past, but what is actually going on right now as a citizens. What are my main concerns?
What are our preoccupations?
What are the thing right now that we should talk about together? And they really felt that we were a place for this. They really felt that, like the breaking news that are going on, either, like it's climate, or it's economy, or it's poverty, or it's iniquities, or like immigration, or like being shelters to the less people that are in needs. They say, this is major, this is things that we should talk about, and you are the one that should talk about that, because you're like my citizen house, like,
I like that idea, citizen house.
Yes, so you're the place where I feel also safe to talk about that, or I want to feel safe to talk about those issues, but I want also to see other point of views. So it was like this really call to be a forum, to be a place where I can share, where I can hear other people talk about those issues that are really concerning me. So we really had, like, it was a kind of a breakthrough for us to hear all those citizens saying that they felt that we were an important place, and not just a virtual one, actually, like a physical place where we could exchange on those matters that really really are important to me as a citizen, and I can say what is important to me. You know, like it's not an institution, it's not a government, it's not someone says that, oh, this thing should be important to you.
Right.
No, I can say it.
Yeah.
I'm the citizen here that can say this is important, and I want to talk about that.
Mhm.
So that was really interesting for us, and it really put more emphasis on all the purpose that we could be, as we could be so much more than just a museum. You know, like, meaning that, because sometimes when people think about museum, they're going to think about artwork, you know, like maybe it's educational
Collection
programs,
space, yeah.
collections, but we could really be a center of change.
Yeah, issues based.
Yeah.